All right, so we're back again. The usual caveat applies. This is just going to be a practice stream, and even like more practice than usual because I don't have any plans on what I'm going to talk about or saying anything. I'm just going to start talking and try to not stop and try to fill time talking about whatever random nonsense that pops into my head, just so I can practice talking into a mic without it being all halting and without me fucking freezing for fucking 20 seconds at a time when I don't know what to say, or stuttering when I don't know what, the usual. So I guess I'll try up again. Since I don't really have anything to talk about, I figured I would just start talking about nothing. I guess it kind of depends on what you would mean by nothing, but I'm going to have it. I'm going to say that it means basically everything and nothing at the same time for maximum vagary. The real bitch about that is there's not really a whole lot to say about nothing. Either it's something that doesn't exist and can't fill space and can't move around, can't be codified to any position, can't be thought about, can't be philosophically analyzed. Or it is all of those things that you can think about, you can identify, you can move, you can define, you can describe characteristics of. There are probably other definitions and varieties of nothing that you can have, but since it is such a strange concept and probably just generally beyond what humans are capable of understanding to begin with, if you wanted to really get into the whole thing, I guess all I can really do is just try to focus and figure out, or focus on one aspect. And then perhaps I'll jump around to other kinds of aspects so I can practice talking. But anyway, as usual, you probably don't want to watch this because it's going to be really rambly and non-entertaining and a waste of your time. But I have to start somewhere, and so I have to practice doing something, so let's talk about nothing. As I said, there's a few different kinds of nothing. There's a Parmenidean kind of nothing, as contrasting as he would contrast to being, and since he thought that being is the only thing that there is, and he used a rigorous logic to come to that kind of conclusion, even though of course it was before Aristotle, so it's before codified syllogistic logic, but it is still logic to say this sort of this kind of thinking, or this kind of rationality, this kind of sense perception, etc. and so forth, can be understood at least in some degree, and you can apply certain kind of characteristics on it to determine whether or not something is nothing or nothing is something. Parmenides was well, actually, I say we don't really know much about Parmenides. We do know that he was an ancient philosopher and an ancient Greek philosopher, although he wasn't Greek. The Meletian schools. Hell was Miletus? I can't remember at the moment. I think Miletus was along the what is now the Italian coast, the eastern coast, so that there would be some going back and forth between them and the Greeks. And mostly what we know about Parmenides comes from other people that are talking about him. Now, we do know that Parmenides wrote a 3,000-line poem back in his day, just kind of describing his general philosophy. Unfortunately, only like 150 or so lines of this poem survives, and that's just because other people were quoting him, so we have some quotes of what he was saying. Most of what I at least know about Parmenides comes from the Platonic dialogue, the Parmenides, where it seems to me that Plato, once again, was using Socrates as his mouthpiece to try to explain his philosophy, and in this, to contrast it with the Meletian school, who was almost certainly putting forth some strong criticism towards Plato's kind of philosophy, and explicitly the theory of forms. So in the Parmenides, the dialogue, there's the ancient philosopher Parmenides. He and his student Zeno of Zeno's Paradox went to Athens and were talking to various kinds of philosophers, and a young Socrates happens upon them while Zeno is explaining an aspect of his theory. And Zeno is no slouch either. He basically, as per what philosophical history tells us, he invented the dialectic, which of course Plato was really super about. And Aristotle was less super about, because he had syllogistics, but the dialectic is necessary for aspects of the syllogistics, and I would say that syllogistics is an evolution of the dialectic. I think dialectic is just where you have to start when you want to start thinking about things naturally. And you have to start thinking about things naturally in order to try to decide what is happening, how it is happening, and then what is going to happen in the future, so you can make predictions to check against what your prediction. So you can make predictions and then use those predictions to check against reality. Now, the dialogue itself starts with Zeno talking about some aspects of the some aspects using his dialectic of applying pure logic and rationale and denying that sensory perception, or the Heraclitean, the other idea of the Heraclitean, where everything is change. He seemed to be wanting to deny it in this dialogue, and so Socrates began talking. A young Socrates. According to the dialectic, it was around 60 years before Plato would be writing it, and it was being retold by, I think, Critias. Maybe somebody else, I can't remember who it was now. But something that almost certainly never would have happened, and if it happened, it was so complicated that there's no damn way anybody could remember the 60 years later what was said. But I suppose to get into it, eventually Parmenides jumped in and started using dialectic against Socrates. And this is one of those rare circumstances where in a Platonic dialogue, somebody beats Socrates using dialectic, and it's of course Parmenides. But Parmenides in the end defeats himself because Plato seemed to use the Meletian idea of the Parmenidean dialectic to say that it basically says nothing, it goes nowhere, it leads nowhere, and it turns into a bunch of nonsense. But anyway, so Parmenides was really, really big into the one. So like one singular being, and everything else is just a reflection of this one singular being. And he used logically exhaustive dialectic to think about these sorts of things. And initially he did it to trounce the Platonic theory of forms, probably echoing what the Meletians and other philosophers were saying to Plato, since, of course, Plato, at his academy, wrote these dialogues, it would seem, in order to provide some instruction to the philosophers that he was training, as the liberal arts people now say, to teach you how to think. And so Parmenides himself seems to not be a big fan of nothing, and that he seems to think that there is only one, and everything else is just a reflection or an echo of this one. So there can't be a nothing, because if everything is one, that's just the one single thing there can be. There cannot be a nothing, because if there is something, then there can't be not that thing, if that thing is going to be the one, so therefore nothingness can't really exist. And then he goes through a logically exhaustive dialectic demonstrating how, through his ideas and how he thinks that the world works, that there can't be a nothing, because everything is one. I mean, if there is just one thing, it can't move because it is already everywhere. And if it can't move and it is already everywhere, there can't be a place where it is not. Therefore, there is nothing. There cannot be nothing, according to Parmenides. Plato himself didn't seem to be particularly on board this idea of nothingness, but he also didn't like the Heraclitean idea that everything is just change rather than the one. And so he kind of seems to have developed his philosophy to work in between the two things. So there is a one, and it can be defined, but it's not one singular thing, because there are different echoes of the one coming from the theory of forms. And the bad things in life are the things where the theory of forms don't... either they participate in a way that we don't understand very well, or they participate not at all. So I guess on that note, the idea of nothingness has fucked with humanity for quite some time, and Eastern philosophers have been fucking with it for quite a while too, although a lot of them likewise seem to have echoed Parmenides' idea, saying that there existing is all that there is, it can't be anywhere else, so therefore there can't be nothing in between the places that exist, because it is one big thing. Therefore nothingness doesn't exist as a philosophical concept, but it can exist as a lack of change in the Heraclitean sense. So, like, if you're talking to, like, an old Janist, nothing isn't a place that you can go to, because there has to be something for you to go there, but it's a state of being that you can enter into where things do not change, your brain does not give you any specific impulses, and then you can clear your brain and do, some clear meditation. Since meditation seems to be the the cornerstone of a lot of Eastern philosophy and how you think about things, it seems that they were pretty big into the idea of nothing, but not a physical place of nothing. So just like the Western philosophers, there's a lot of contradictions internally going in a whole bunch of different directions and whatever way you want to go and what do you want to say. Philosophers have continued to opine as to what is or could be nothing, likewise contrasted to what is something, and what is a place, what is a turn, what is a time, etc., and so forth. Now, physics itself doesn't seem to actually, modern day physics, especially of the quantum variety, doesn't seem to have much ado about nothing, because physics, quantum physics in particular, is a set of rigorous mathematical models which allows you to determine the probability that an event happens. And usually an event happens in quantum physics, it's because some operator via a boson or some lepton or some hadron is moving around through space, but the probability that there is something going on in all those spaces, including with virtual particles, means that there probably is absolutely never a nothing, because you can only... It's really hard to measure nothing, I guess we'll put it that way. It's easier to measure something and to calculate the probability that an event can happen by something moving, something interacting with something turning into something else. But the nothing is never there. Since quantum physics is basically measuring the frequency and probability that an event can happen and that all of these things are moving around, doing together, and interacting, there really can't be a nothing, because you have to have something in order to measure something. It's really, really hard to measure nothing. Like, you can measure the speed of light, but can you measure the speed of lack of light? I guess it would just be the speed of light moving away from wherever your thing is, but it's just really hard to quantify. Hard as fuck to quantify nothing, so it kind of just ignores the whole idea, just to say, well, these are the things that exist, these are the probabilities where you can find the things that exist, and once you add up all of these probabilities, you get some number by which you can make predictions and then use the predictions to measure what you see in reality and determine whether or not the predictions match reality. So it's really hard to get into nothing in both the old philosophical, although it's easier, of course, than the modern day scientific. Although lots of modern philosophy still deals with lots of aspects of nothing, like the null hypothesis, which is to say you're in a room, or how about this picture? You're off in this leafy thing with some kind of death omen figure in the distance. Now, if that death omen figure wasn't there, would there be a negative death figure to take its place? Or if that death figure is there a negative figure everywhere else where he is not? You can think about it this way, and there's useful aspects in the null hypothesis in philosophy to determine how some things work, but it doesn't seem to be able to be applied universally, because you're kind of just throwing in a whole bunch of extra things to explain the lack of something rather than to explain the thing that's there. There are uses for that in philosophy, but it's not particularly useful, I guess, is just the way to go. The null hypothesis is very interesting, though, just to say that anywhere there is something, there means that means that it's possible that you can think about saying it to say that because this thing is there, that means the negative thing or the lack of thing is everywhere else, and then so you actually apply a like positive operator to say this thing is not here, just to determine this thing is here. But that doesn't really help you a whole lot in determining why the thing is there, what it's doing there, the who, what, when, where, why, how, just because all you can do with a null hypothesis is say it is not there. And then try to figure out whatever philosophical ramifications can come from it being not there. I think about nothing all the time, just because it's just so hard for me to grasp, put my head around. Because just when I think that I'm on the verge of being able to understand what nothing is, I go, oh wait, no, this can't be working, because in order for me to make a model of something in my head, or even a model of nothing, it still has to be something. I have to actively apply some kind of value to it in order to determine whether it exists or not, and how it reacts with other things. And it's really hard to say, all right, nothing is a thing that you can use to quantify whether or not it, in relation to other things, impacts the whole system in any way or shape or form. So even though I find it entertaining to think about those sorts of things, I basically have never ever gotten anywhere with it, just because I cannot get my mind around nothing. As soon as I do, it becomes something, and of course something is not nothing, and you get into the old Parmenides problem again. Nothing, man, nothing. There are other ways at which you can apply nothing more consistently, rather than just the weird Platonic ideal of nothing. And you can actually use it for certain sorts of things. Like, of course, in mathematics, 0 is a thing, and 0 is technically nothing, although it's still a variable, so it's still something. But you can still apply it to a whole bunch of other different aspects in mathematics, going, positive to the positive integers and going negative to the negative integers and everything that entails with the 23 axioms of mathematics that you have to use to do any kind of first-order logic. Of course, is all mathematics is first-order logic, although there's kinds of math that use higher-order logic that's less common and less intuitive, so I'm just going to avoid that. So there's certainly kinds of nothings that you can use, although since it's something, it's technically not nothing, therefore it's not exactly what we're trying to get at, but it's still useful and still worth thinking about. And it's quite possible that if you were able to in some way conceive of nothing or an absolute complete lack of things, the parallel analysis of looking at things that you can kind of call nothing but is something like 0 or like a void is something that you can use to try to figure it out to determine the characteristics of how it would work if you did find a genuine true void. Now, most voids in space, some people for a short term, like a shortcut, can say that there's nothing going on in space, but that's of course nonsense. Space is itself something. It has properties. It has quantifiable properties, and it does all kinds of things. But it's usually full of something. And if it's not full specifically of matter made up of electrons or other kinds of leptons and hadrons and protons and neutrons and all that stuff, it at least has their boson operators, so light or what have you, or even gravity going through it. So there is something going on in all of the voids in space that we've ever seen, if you consider space to be isometric, which you don't really have any reason not to assume that it's going to be isometric, because if it's not isometric, you can't make any predictions, and then you know nothing about it. So if you assume it's isometric, so it looks the same way every direction going out, and you know that there's at least photons, if not a few other minor particles in certain portions of it, then you can't really say that space itself is empty. It's always full of stuff, and even space itself is moving, like Einstein's cosmological constant said that because of gravity, space should be shrinking, and because of different kinds of pressures, it could be pushing against each other. So the cosmological constant was the thing that basically held it in place and stopped all of space from expanding more or contracting more. Which modified was sort of discovered in the 1990s when people began looking for standard candles in astronomy to look out into the vast distances of space and see what the hell it is that they could see. One of the ways, the ingenious way, is they took a kind of supernova called supernova 1A, which is a supernova that happens when a white dwarf, so basically the remnants of an old star where it was not massive enough to collapse into a neutron star or a black hole. There was enough material in it, and it's still massive enough, and there's enough gravitational pressure pushing on it that it becomes electron degenerate matter. So basically, you're squeezing things into a point so hard that it all turns into electrons. And by the nature of the Pauli exclusion principle, electrons can't fill the same space as other electrons unless they're a different spin. But since you only have two different kinds of spin, that means that you can only fit 2 electrons in any given, little bunch of space. So all the electrons kind of bunch up around one another. But because of other kinds of quantum effects pushing them away from each other, it doesn't exactly make electrons touch. They're just as close together as you can get. As close together you can get without putting more energy in it, which would turn it into something else. But you can put more energy into it, so you can squeeze an electron harder. And what it seems to happen when you squeeze an electron harder than its degeneracy pressure, it turns into either a neutrons, which is a different degeneracy pressure, and a more compact, smaller kind of star called a neutron star, which of course is what all the pulsars are a variety of. Or you can squeeze it even more and it becomes a black hole, which I'm not going to get into that right now, but I probably will later, because it's definitely something having to do with nothing when you're talking about black holes. But anyway, I forgot what I was saying, having to do with nothing, talking about electron degeneracy pressure. Oh yes, alright, so they took these white dwarfs, which are under electron degeneracy pressure, and they noticed that if it's around a companion star, and it seems that a large amount of stars that we've been able to observe are binary stars at least, or even more. So there's a lot of stars out in our universe, that most of them that we can't see, but in our galaxy we can see a few varieties, and we can see a few distinct individual stars if they're large enough in other galaxies that are semi-close. But the interesting thing about supernovas is they explode with so much energy that you can see them from all the way across the universe. And the interesting thing about 1A supernovas, so these white dwarfs under an electron degeneracy pressure, they can, once they accrue a certain amount of other material from its companion star growing around it, it explodes basically in naked fusion, and it releases so much energy that you can see it all the way from, all the way across the universe. But also, it seems to, the energies that it takes, that it absorbs from its companion star, so it's soaking up material from its companion star and absorbing it onto its surface, it seems to have like a very consistent threshold for how much energy is released. Therefore, whenever we see a 1A, they basically look the same, no matter where you are. Even if the progenitor stars and the progenitor white dwarf is different, the same amount of energy is required to suck from the looser star onto the white dwarf in order to make it explode into that Type 1A supernova. And so they were assuming, and it's probably a safe assumption, that most Type 1A supernovas are similar enough in energy that you can use them as standard candles. So when they go, they'll always basically be the same brightness. And you can determine how far away something is by how bright it is, and especially if it's really bright. So they were looking for these Type 1 supernova A because they have a really specific spectral signature, so that if you see one, it's pretty easy to guess that it's a 1A, and then you can do a few other kinds of analysis to determine how far away it was. So researchers used these tools to look at standard candles of Type 1A supernovas exploding in other galaxies and determine that the universe is not static, that it is in fact expanding. So going back to the nothingness thing, this means that the nothingness of space, which is kind of what scientists were consuming, leaving out the quantum physics aspect, just to on a macro scale, if there's not a bunch of big things in the space, you can kind of consider it empty, and therefore you can call it nothing, even though it's definitely not, because quantum physics absolutely tells us it's not. But this also tells us that it's absolutely not, because this data showed that the universe is expanding. Whenever they would look at something, Type 1A supernova going off in a galaxy that was relatively close, so say like 10 million light years, they would know its brightness obviously would be different than one that has the same kind of signature but from 30 million light years away or 10 billion light years away. And they were able to find that whenever they see these things going off and measuring the intensity of the light, and if it fits the 1A spectra, that space has been expanding ever since whatever began our universe. And it's accelerating as it gets larger. So that also suggests that because there are at least 3 properties of the vacuum that we can understand, that things are moving into them, that they're expanding, and that the expansion is accelerating as time goes on, definitely shows us that there's enough characteristics in it to tell us that it is not nothing, aside from the quantum physics idea. But once you put quantum physics in, of course, you understand that why there is nothing, because there's some energy potential basically everywhere you could go. So that kind of nothing doesn't exist, but it's still an interesting one to think of, to think about and consider in that parallel analysis when you're trying to figure out what the hell real nothing is. That expansion thing, interestingly enough, almost nobody was expecting it to be coming, because, well, why would you? Why would you expect that when we see what gravity is, and we didn't know that there was another pressure that Einstein codified as the cosmological constant, but it just turned out that the way Einstein calculated the cosmological constant so that it would equal 0, it actually doesn't. You have to change the variable so that it equals 1, so that there's an outward pressure fighting against gravity and completely defeating gravity on the large macro scale, pushing everything, so all of the the points in space apart from one another. Which again means that it's not nothing. But maybe you wanted to say, all right, so maybe if we look isometrically outside of the known variables of the universe, so say if everything in the universe was at some point, in a Big Bang condition, and then it split apart and space began spreading these things out, and then whatever these things are doing inside of it, so turning into electrons, turning into anti-electrons, etc. and so forth. The stuff that's outside of this stuff that was beginning that before the stretching could be nothing. But again, if the Big Bang existed within it, then it kind of had to be something, because whatever it was something that was not the Big Bang, therefore you could define it as at least anti-Big Bang, therefore not nothing, because it's technically something. But as far as I can tell, it's kind of the closest we've got to it, unless you consider different, physical interpretations and dimensions as things where no energy can exist and therefore there is nothing there. But if you don't have any energy existing there, you can't measure anything, you can't determine time from this second to that second or any other arbitrary point in between. And that actually might be a good qualification for nothing. But again, if it actually did exist, you would never be able to detect it, because it has to be doing something in order for you to detect it, and in order for you to do calculations as to how it would work. So that kind of leaves you to another dead end of how nothing works. So space and time itself absolutely can't be a nothing. It has to be a something by all definitions in which it has been applied, because just like quantum physics, general relativity is calculating the probability that an event can happen. So it's just calculating event probabilities rather than, this is like following this is orbiting this and all that sort of thing. But that, general relativity is really fucking complicated and weird in that way. But suffice it to say, it does not calculate anything having to do with nothing. There's always something there going on because you're calculating events. So it leaves us to another nothing dead end. It seems to be just the general trend where every time you try to think about nothing, it just leads you to nowhere. Now, you can just like take the philosophical idea, so just say, all right, I'm going to put everything that we know about everything else aside for the moment and just consider like bare bones one-dimensional nothingness. Which, again, is one of those things that I try to do all the time, but I always fail because it always turns into something when I try to apply anything that I know about anything else to it. So, I mean, maybe it's just my problem. Maybe other people won't have any problem actually figuring out, like, conceptualizing what nothing is, and by that conceptualization, not turning it into something, and then therefore making it absolutely not nothing. But I haven't yet, so I guess all I can do is just keep thinking and keep going and hoping that I actually get somewhere eventually whilst doing this. Let's get into a different kind of nothing. So let's talk about the black hole variety of nothing. Now, a black hole, in general relativity, is just basically what happens when something is so dense that it warps gravity, warps the inverse square nature of gravity to the point that at certain points very close to whatever this thing is within its Schwarzschild's radius, that it bends space so much that anything that goes into it exceeds the space falling into it exceeds the speed of causality, or otherwise known as the speed of light. So things can't get out of it once it's at a certain distance from whatever this central point is. Now, we know that black holes aren't nothing because they interact with things around them. They're made of the space that has a bunch of stuff in it, and a black hole, by definition, is something because it has mass. But we don't really know a whole lot else about it aside from that, and aside from how general relativity predicts its mechanics will work. But there's a lot of interesting ideas of like what might actually be inside black holes that could maybe lead us to the idea that of nothing. Like Lee Smolin, he's a physicist that came up with an evolutionary black hole idea, which says that universes, for whatever reason, pop into existence, mass accrues in them, they make black holes. These black holes begin sucking in material and infinitely warping space and time, and inside the center of this black hole, which we call singularity because you can't use any physics that we've ever thought of to make any predictions of what's going on, the energy and directions and all that is too high for us to make any sense of it. But Lee Smolin says maybe that's the point, because it's going into another universe. It's creating another universe, so every time there's a big hole and it absorbs something, it creates a new Big Bang inside of that. And likewise, this keeps descending, and making its own big black holes with its own little universes inside it until you get the correct conditions for our kind of universe to exist, where the fine-tuned constant is so specifically fine-tuned that the energy can exist the way it does, and then eventually you can make stars and electrons and protons and life, and gravity works in this way. So it's just perfectly, I shouldn't say perfect, because fucking the universe is a harsh motherfucker and really, really good at killing anything that would actually work as life. But it at least allows the capacity for a chemical trick of life to happen where it starts reproducing itself, and then eventually, through its own evolutionary process, it creates something like a human brain, which has the capacity to, at least to a limited degree, understand itself. Because all we are as living things are basically atoms that have gained the ability to kind of understand and think about themselves. Now, with as fine-tuned as the fine-tuned constant is, and then a whole bunch of other things. I mean, this is not the anthropological principle where it says that our universe exists because in order for humans to exist in it and start contemplating it. The idea of this is like uncounted universes exist, each one with probably its own differing laws of physics laws of physics which govern how everything works into it, and our universe just happens to be one of the ones where the laws of physics were conducive to the chemical trick of life reproducing itself and making it so atoms were eventually capable of understanding themselves. Now, where nothing would come in on that is the other variety, so the other black holes and perhaps our universe or other universes, or black holes that lead into new universes in our universe, and then new universes in those universes, which might actually make nothing. It might. All right, so say like a black hole exists in some universe, and it begins sucking things in infinitely warping space, and that creates our Big Bang. So whatever material was sucked in from that initial creation of the Big Bang creates all of the matter and physical states in our universe. Now, if like a few physical constant variables were a little different, our universe would look very, very, very different. And so it's possible that out of enough of these, so say you have 10 billion 10 billion black holes, so 10 billion universes, and then infinite universes coming from the ones that progenited this one, and then the ones that, you make up the universes that fall from black holes in this universe and black holes in this universe, making new black holes in this universe. It's possible that eventually the variables can be set so that nothing exists in whatever that black hole happens in. So say there's a Big Bang, but nothing actually happens in it because the laws of physics in that universe are not conducive to energy doing anything. So maybe there's no conservation of mass or conservation of energy or any of those things. So there is absolutely, positively nothing there. Now that is a way that you can actually kind of conceptualize and think about nothing, although it's very, very hypothetical and it's completely difficult to understand in any way that we can, at least I, can try to formulate it. But I think it's about as close to not just Bezier philosophical conceptual nothing as I can get. But it still has to be something because it's still created by something. It's still moving around in some other thing. So it's still probably not nothing. It's just like a special variety of nothing, or a special variety of lack of something rather than nothing. Difficult concept, but it's one of the few things that I've been able to, at least by myself, think of that would allow you to get to that point. But there is a way, even in our universe, where it's possible to conceptualize it using physics to say that there isn't something there, and that is just to increase the scale so much that, say you're zooming in on something. You zoom in, sorry, so say you want to zoom in on an atom, so you use your theoretical microscope or whatever to zoom in on it so that you can see the nucleus and then the electron probability field moving around it. Now, you keep zooming so that you zoom past all of the electrical forces in the lepton that makes it do what it does, and the forces inside the nucleus or the hadron that does what it does, so the gluons and the quarks. And you keep zooming. You zoom to the point where you keep zooming in on basically an empty portion of space, and you zoom in to the point where any kind of energy because energy has to exist as a wavelength at those scales. So you zoom in past deeper than the smallest possible wavelength that energy can exist at. And if you do that, you might find a whole new set of things that you'd have to figure out how those things work. But as far as how quantum physics work with its smallest possible energy, because that's the whole point of what a quanta is, quantify, you get it to its smallest possible bit, and then you start calculating how it works from there. If you keep going down from that, where no energy can exist because it's smaller than that, it's possible then that you actually have found a kind of nothing. Although it's obviously still something because it's still within space and time, even though you couldn't measure anything there because there's nothing to compare it to. Aside from the black hole thing, that is one of the only other ways we've been able to conceptualize how nothing works, just something that's so small that no energy can exist into it. But being that when you stack those up, eventually energy can exist into it, for obviously it's not completely nothing, and that you can conceptualize it as something means it's not nothing, because nothing would, of course, be something that you would be unable to conceptualize. So there is another way of trying to think about nothing, but it's still not particularly useful except for to say, hey, there's another thing that I can use with parallel analysis to try to figure out the characteristics of this thing, to try to conceptualize how to get rid of those characteristics, to conceptualize nothing. Which again is a hard goddamn thing to do, but something that at least I think is generally worth doing, and so I try to do in order to try to figure it out. It is an odd endeavor trying to, I haven't devoted my life to trying to figure out nothing, but I spend a lot of time thinking about it just to see if I can figure it out. And as I said, I've completely completely failed in every attempt that I've ever tried to do it, but it doesn't mean I'm not going to continue trying. And it doesn't mean I don't learn things about the things that I'm using for parallel analysis, likewise going backwards. So I try to use the concepts of things that are not nothing, but that are almost nothing to try to conceptualize nothing. But then likewise, once I try to figure out how that it doesn't work as nothing, it allows me to go backwards in the analysis and look at these things that are almost nothing and learn more logical consequences about them and how they would work. So even though it really goes nowhere for the initial idea to understand nothing, it still helps me understand the other things that are almost or close to nothing much better than it would if I didn't do that kind of analysis. So there actually does seem to be some sort of use to it, as the philosophers kind of understood, because once again they were trying to contrast that the logos is making distinctions between things so that you can explain them either separate from other things, so as its own standalone idea, or in congregation or congruence with other things, to say this is just how it all works together. I suppose what that means is I'm basically in exactly the same, well, not exactly because they were much smarter than me, but in kind of the same predicament as the ancient philosophers going up to the modern philosophers and still being completely unable to understand any aspect or or conceptual framework to get nothing. But it doesn't mean I'm not going to keep trying, and obviously it was enough for me to try to ramble about so that I could learn to speak in a mic without talking to anybody and talk about nothing with no pre-plan. So I guess I did kind of get something out of it, although it's certainly not what I was looking for, and it's certainly not getting me any closer to the idea that I can conceptualize nothing. Still have a lot of things to try to think about, and I'm sure, once again, as I said initially, I don't think that the human mind is capable of understanding nothing because it is made of these same quantum things, and since these quantum things are all just about smoothing out the probability that events can happen, your brain is tailored to measure events rather than lack of events, which is also probably why the null hypothesis is such a weird thing. But as ever, we just keep triting those boards and trying to think about what's going on and what's going to happen next. And even if it does go nowhere, it's still sometimes very fun when you're not doing anything else of any value. But like for me, when I'm just sitting here doing nothing, or sometimes when I'm driving, and I just let my subconscious do the driving because it's a straight road on a straight shot on a highway where I don't have to think about anything and there's no one else there. So basically, I just have to allow my muscle memory to keep the vehicle going straight and going and maintaining the same speed, and I can just think about whatever the hell I want. So I do that sort of thing all the goddamn time. And it's not always just about nothing. That's just one of the things I think about. I think about all kinds of different things. But nothing is one of those things that really does fuck with my brain because, it's the oblivion. It's the void. It's the thing I believe that the human brain is programmed genetically to fear the most. But it's also where, all things would have the conceptual spaces where all ideas and all those sorts of things have to come from. So I believe that it's probably not only worth it, but you get some benefit from it even if it doesn't go anywhere, because at least you're using your brain to think about something and trying to apply it to figure out how the universe works. But even so, you still get nowhere with it. At least I've gotten nowhere with it. So I guess going over those few different kinds of nothing and saying that I've actually gotten no insights into what's going on, now all I can do is just hope in the future that eventually some human or human-like thing comes about that has the neurological programming or the electronical programming or whatever it is to finally be able to conceptualize nothing and to communicate it to other beings so that they can understand nothing. I don't know what the hell kind of thing it would take to do this, because I don't understand the nature of nothing, and I barely understand the nature of neurology and quantum physics and all that stuff anyway. So I don't understand how those would coalesce to be able to make something that can figure out nothing. But I sure do hope it fucking eventually happens, because I don't really think we really have anywhere else to go. And I do think that because of that two-way analysis, where the better you can kind of understand nothing, the better you can understand the things that you're trying to use to conceptualize nothing. It might make it so that we can understand those things well enough that we can actually finally conceptualize nothing. And if not we, maybe, some other being on some other planet, or some evolved human, or some human hyperspace robot hybrid. I don't know what the fuck it would be. If I could predict the future, I probably wouldn't have any problem talking into a mic about this nonsense, because, I could just tell you what's going to happen in the future. But I don't know, so there's another limitation there. But I'm going to at least keep thinking about nothing until I die, or I lack the capacity to comprehend any aspect of it due to some brain damage or catastrophic neurological disorder or something like that. But I know for a fact eventually I'm going to die. And incidentally, I think that's a good thing. I've also spent a lot of time thinking about oblivion and eternity going the other direction, so just imagining what it would be like to live forever. And I definitely know I don't want to do that. Definitely know not only is it good for biological entities to die because it allows new biological entities to take their place and use the same resources that they were using. I mean, quite literally, like down to the electrons and protons. But also to keep changing with whatever environment and whatever world they find themselves in keeps changing, because that's how evolution works. It's about adapting variables to a rate of change to better suit whatever the outcome of those variables are to whatever environment happens, because one thing that seems to be very consistent is the environment always changes. Although there is a way that the environment wouldn't change, and that is if the heat death theory and idea of the universe, if there's anything to that. So just to say, like, in the very, very distant future, since entropy being what it is, it continually disperses energy at a specific rate,